Hey guys, so today we are picking up in lesson 2 of our study of the Satanic Rebellion series, in particular part 4, talking about Satan's world system. So this week we are going to go through the introduction section of the study, which kind of discusses Adam and Eve and their situation, and then how we compare to them as a method of framing what we are going to be talking about for the rest of the study. So here is the outline of the points that we are going to be going through today. So first, we're going to be talking about the title of the introduction, which includes this concept of Satan's rebellion and fall, and perhaps why this is in the title of the introduction, even though not much time is spent on it in the body of the introduction. Then we're going to go through what the introduction to the study actually talks about, which is the life that Adam and Eve lived after the fall, and then our situation and how it is parallel to that. So we're going to talk about the contrast between pre-fall paradise and post-fall realities, God's promise of deliverance, so that applies to Adam and Eve in context, but also us, and then talk about how we are now in our practical life circumstances versus how they were after they were evicted from the Garden of Eden. After this, we're going to go ahead and outline the first big section in the study, which is titled Strangers in the Devil's Realm. So this week, we will just be going over the points in this section at a very high level. So we are going to introduce these points, and then in future weeks, we are going to come back and hit all of these things in much more depth. So, as I mentioned, even though the introduction of the study that we are going through here in SR4 doesn't really talk too much explicitly about Satan's rebellion and fall, I want to talk about why this is actually in the title of the introduction, and perhaps why in our study here, Satan's rebellion is mentioned even before we talk about anything else. So, this might seem a little bit confusing in as much as the introduction itself, as we will examine in the coming minutes, mostly talks about how we compare to Adam and Eve, a then and now, if you will. While I certainly can't speak for Dr. Luganbill, my guess as to why this is the leading point in the title of the introduction is just because this is the wider context of the whole series. So the series that this particular study is in is called the Satanic Rebellion series. And so in terms of this series, it is the first segment of the study that actually talks about Satan's initial state and then his fall. However, today we are going to be going through the outline of the first section in this study, dealing with how we actually live in this present world. So the reason why this would be included then is for a manner of context. So if our existence is a war on a battlefield, then this creation turned into a battlefield at the point when Satan rebelled against God, at the point when he lifted his hand against his creator. And so, as we'll see on the next slide, it really is sort of a method of framing everything that we go through here to just keep in the back of our heads that the chain of causality leading to where we are today was kicked off in creature history by Satan's initial rebellion. So, just as we are sort of starting en medias res here in the study, so into the middle of things, we are born into this world in the middle of a grand spiritual conflict that greatly transcends our own individual lives. So, what I mean by that is that while it may be very easy for us to get focused on our personal circumstances or the things in our lives specifically, we as Christians are actually born into this world being part of a battle raging between God and Satan that has been going on ever since Satan rebelled against God a very long time ago. So the beginning of this narrative, and this story, if you will end with Satan's complete and total defeat at the end of this present creation, and then the establishment of a new glorious universe where only righteousness and uprightness dwells, God dwelling with us as men and also angels in perfect unity. So this story started all that long time ago when Satan, who was the preeminent guardian angel of God's holiness, vainly thought in his mind to usurp God's place on the throne of the universe. And so all that time ago was when the rebellion kicked off and when the universe positionally became broken, this separation between perfect God and our present creation. Now, the earlier parts in the Satanic Rebellion series, so we are in part 4 right now, but the earlier parts get us from there, so Satan's initial fall to the Genesis gap. That's what the second part talks about. So God's judgment of the fallen universe after Satan's rebellion, and then the creation of man in part 3, talking about man's purpose in this wider conflict. And then, of course, we're in part 4, but part 5 will take us even further by outlining God's plan for human history in terms of the 7 millennial days. And this includes how the rest of history, past where we are at present, will unfold. However, what we're talking about right here in the study is an examination of how Satan exerts his control over the world. So, this is kind of where the rubber hits the road for us as Christians at present, because we are studying what the world is really like for us now, today. And with all of this said, we are spending time talking about this up front here, and we will continue to re examine it just because this wider context, so the echoes of Satan's initial rebellion and fall that set the world into motion how it is now, and then also just in general, this idea that existence is playing out on a grand spiritual stage. There are elements in play much larger than us in the background. As we keep these things in mind, it can help us in the study because keeping that big picture in our heads can be one of the best ways for us to see through some of the illusions that the world puts before us. So, having now talked a little bit about why this might be in the title of the introduction and why we should keep the wider context of Satan's rebellion and fall in mind, not only as we talk about these things today, but also as we move forward from week to week, now we'll actually get into the section of what is in the introduction to this study. So, if we go there here from that table of contents link, you can see that this is the first part of the study. And there's several paragraphs here, and I've broken them out into slides to make the content easier for us to look at things one at a time. But the introduction primarily deals with how Adam and Eve lived after the fall and how that compares to the circumstances that we now find ourselves in. So these are the points that we're going to hit because these are the things the introduction mostly talks about. So the first thing is going to be the contrast between pre-fall paradise in the Garden of Eden and post-fall realities after they were evicted from the garden. God's promise of deliverance. So this is through the prophecy in Genesis 3:15, which we'll get to when we actually talk about this. And then the so-called protoevangelium, or the first gospel, when God gave Adam and Eve skins of animals to clothe themselves. Well, this blood sacrifice foreshadows Christ's death for us on the cross that ultimately saves us from our sins. And then finally, we're going to talk about how their situation, as the points that we make up here, compares to how we find ourselves living in this broken and fallen world, even up until this day. So this first point, talking about the pre-fall paradise versus post-fall realities, mostly centers on the things that changed after Adam and Eve found themselves out of the perfect garden. So one thing that changed is rather than having everything provided for them and living this life of leisure, everything suddenly started requiring them to work. So instead of abundant prosperity ready at hand, they had entered a world of limitation, shortage, and scarcity. And instead of a world where all their needs were instantly provided for without any effort on their part, now backbreaking toil was necessary for survival. So these are elements of the so-called Genesis curse placed upon man after Adam and Eve disobeyed God and were subsequently kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So aside from having to work and toil on this earth, our ancient parents would now also experience for the first time all of the destructive and sinful emotions like fear, jealousy, and hostility, because now life was suddenly no longer perfect for them. And of course, as early chapters in Genesis make clear, the domestic tranquility, so the peace between men, as it were, would soon become shattered as Cain murdered his brother Abel out of jealousy and resentment. And so all of these things are coming together to show the very different picture of how life in this world operated after the fall as opposed to how it was before the fall. And to top all of this off, after this life of pain and toil, and now all these other negative things that we face, well, after all this, Adam and Eve would now experience physical death. This is the consequence of eating that fruit of the sin and separation from God, which is a form of immediate spiritual death for us. But our parents would now also face physical death. So, after going through all of these hard things, life sort of robs you of any meaning by not letting you take anything with you. So you work for all of these things, and then you cannot take anything out of this world. All right, so the second point made in this section is that even despite all of this, God did not leave Adam and Eve as orphans on the earth, completely bereft of all hope and separate from Him. So in the first judgment that rendered our first parents mortal, that condemned them to die a physical death out of their separation from God, God also promised them in the prophecy of Genesis 3:15, the seed who would one day crush the head of the serpent who had deceived them. So we're going to go ahead and read Genesis 3:15 here. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. So this prophecy was fulfilled on the cross when Jesus Christ defeated death and redeemed us, our fallen humanity, back to God, mending the rift caused by the initial fall of Adam and Eve, so that humans have now been reconciled to God. And the sacrifice here that God speaks of, the fulfillment of Jesus crushing Satan's head, actually also shows up in Genesis, foreshadowed by the clothes that God gave Adam and Eve after they recognized their nakedness. And the giving of the clothes is often called the protoevangelium, which literally translates as first gospel. So God gives them these clothes to replace their own inadequate efforts. And this represents symbolically the sacrifice that Jesus would come to make for us on the cross by dying in our place. And so before Adam and Eve even left Eden, so even though they had sinned and were now subject to God's judgment upon them and faced these curses of toil and physical death, God had already given them a new tree of life, as it were, to replace the one that they had voluntarily forsaken. And so that would be the cross of Jesus Christ, foreshadowed in the two ways that we've just talked about, that already has given us humans the chance for eternal life if we just accept what God has already done for us. And so Adam and Eve only had to accept God's generous offer of grace, trusting Him for their deliverance after they would face physical death, because physical death is now the reality after the fall that cannot be avoided in this world. So this was the state that Adam and Eve found themselves in after the fall. But for us, life hasn't actually changed all that much in the 6,000 years or so since then. The critical issue for every human being is identical now to what it was then. We must all choose whether or not to accept through faith God's solution to the problem of sin and death in the person of Jesus Christ and what He's done for us on the cross. Moreover, just as Adam and Eve were left in the world beyond the point of faith, so also we today are not immediately transferred to our heavenly home after salvation, but remain here in the world to prove our faith, to grow in it, and to help others do the same. And so that is to say, after being kicked out of Eden, Adam and Eve were not immediately taken up to heaven after believing, nor were they immediately killed on the spot, but they were given a chance to live out the remainder of their lives trusting God in faith, to demonstrate that they did trust Him, that they did trust the promises that He had given them. And so this is kind of going to tie us, all of this discussion that we've talked about Adam and Eve and their situation and how our situation today is still actually really parallel because we still live in the same broken world. We're now going to kind of tie that into where we're going to be going for the next few weeks in the study. So I'm just going to go ahead and read this paragraph here, which kind of comes at the end of the introduction. So, thus, as followers of God and believers in Jesus Christ, we can be forgiven for feeling ill at ease in this present world where we are scarcely even seem to belong, for it is not a place where the knowledge of God abounds and the will of God is always done. On the contrary, this perilous world through which we pass lies largely under the influence of the evil one. And so last week I had brought up this verse in Ephesians chapter 2 in the questions and answers video as support that Satan really is the ruler of this world. And this section actually mentions 1 John chapter 5, verse 19, which actually states it even more explicitly. This was just a cross-reference I happen to remember off the top of my head. But we know that the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. So it's not just bits of the world, it's the whole world. And so with this in mind, just how Adam and Eve found themselves in this fallen, broken world after they were evicted from the garden, this world now under the control of Satan, so too do we find ourselves there. And just as Adam and Eve, no doubt, felt alienated from this world, as if they did not belong in it because it is only our temporary home until we go to be with our Creator, so too will we now find ourselves as strangers in this land. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next section and probably for the next few weeks in the study. All right, so as I mentioned, this is the first big point that we are going to be going through in the study, this idea that we as Christians are strangers in the devil's realm. And so as you can see here, we have some subpoints to this section. And so these are the things that we are going to be going over. Now this week, just due to time constraints and just because this is going to be an introduction, I'm just going to go over the subsections at a high level. So the things that we're going to go over are how we are sojourners in the devil's world, the vanity of life, the hostility of the world, the battlefield we now find ourselves on spiritually, and then the enemy, which is to say Satan. So the first of these subsections is talking about the concept of us as sojourners in the devil's world. So just like Adam and Eve before us, as we just talked about, we've been left in this strange and alien world where the blinding reality of God is largely obscured from view, revealed almost exclusively in his word to those who seek him out. So until the time that God comes again and redeems us and the world in total victory over Satan, we wait for something better as homeless wanderers in a world which finds our perspective and our hope worthless, even foolish or idiotic. So the belief we have in Jesus Christ, what sets us apart from unbelievers, may seem to all the world madness. But nonetheless, the world will not accept us as its own because we truly do not belong here. Our hearts are with the kingdom of God, which is not of this present world. So we will always find ourselves alienated from the world and living as strangers and foreigners here. Right. Second high level point in this section is talking about the vanity of life. And so we mentioned when talking about the effects of the curse that we now toil because of the Genesis curse. We now have to break our backs to earn our bread, so to speak. But even after all that, at the end of our lives, no man can escape death. So we work and we work for what? To face physical death at the end of our lives as an unavoidable reality. And so this existential pointlessness, if you will, is something that we now face in life because we can't escape our own sinfulness and we can't escape death. And so this is the effects here in the verse that comes right after the promise that God gave. God lays down the effects that are going to come from the fall. And so it is just as we've said here that we now must work and that our lives will be difficult and short, and then we perish after that, facing a perfect God with our own sinfulness. And so this idea of a difficult life upon which you can't escape death, this is the vanity of life that is under discussion in this point. And there's more as well. Of course, the book of Ecclesiastes talks about other pointlessness in the world, such as when you die, you don't necessarily choose whom your wealth goes to, or maybe not everything goes how you want in life. There are uncontrollable things out of your control. But primarily here, we have our focus on the effects of the fall and what that means for us in terms of life being essentially vain and pointless because all of us will eventually face physical death. All right, so the third point here, so we talked about how we are essentially sojourners and aliens in this strange world controlled by the devil, and the essential vanity of life, because we all face death as an unavoidable reality. So the third point is talking about the hostility of the world. And so anyone who's been watching the other series we have going on parapatiology will know that we've been talking about life as a spiritual battlefield and basically the world treating us as enemies. But we've been on that subject for a long time in that study. Um, but if we but turn towards God, having been reconciled to him through Jesus Christ, um, we will unavoidably be alienated from the world. And we cannot in any way serve two masters. So either we are friends of God or friends of the world. And this verse from James chapter 4. So James 4:4 says this very explicitly, that friendship with the world is hostility towards God. Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. It truly is that black and white. And on the flip side, if we consider ourselves friends of God, we will earn the world's hostility. Jesus talks about this in John chapter 15. I believe it picks up at verse 18 that talks about this. As just previously mentioned in that other study, we've been talking about this point very specifically as well. Life for us as Christians as a spiritual battlefield. And so, beyond our alienation from the world, beyond its essential futility, and even beyond the enmity that is between the world and us, this world is also a battlefield where the struggle between Satan's present kingdom and the coming kingdom of heaven continues to be played out in deadly earnest. So, this is the wider spiritual conflict behind everything that happens in this world. And we would do well to remember that this is the case, that we are in a fight in this life. We are in a constant struggle. And that is actually the sort of mindset that we should adopt as we move forward. So we have no chance to catch our breath, no time to rest, because we are fighting for our spiritual lives as Christians in this world. Okay, so last high level point that we're going to go over here, introducing the points that we will be talking about in this section on us as strangers in the devil's realm, is the idea of Satan as our enemy. So, having been evicted from the family of God and cast down to rule this kingdom of dust, but only for a short time, because the lake of fire is always positionally imminent for Satan. Well, given all of this, of course, Satan is going to be anything but friendly towards those of us who follow God. So, as we humans continue to replace him and his followers in the family of God, it actually would be quite strange if Satan did not pour out his wrath upon us, like a boxed in animal raging against the end it knows is coming. So, Satan knows that his end is sealed and the time is short for him. And so, just as cornered animals become all the more vicious in that, so too does Satan pour out his wrath upon us in the world. And so, in fact, in the not so distant future, God will put down Satan before or forever. But in the meantime, we as believers in this world will face his wrath. And this is actually completely unavoidable because we are a target that Satan can actually touch in this world, although not without God limiting what he can do to us substantially. All right, so that is our high level introduction to what we will be talking about in the coming weeks, this section on how we are strangers in the devil's world. So we will come back and talk about all of these points in more depth. But today we just gave just a couple sentences overview for each of these about the points that we will be going over in the time to come. So today we started by talking about how it is good and useful for us to keep Satan's rebellion and fall in the back of our head as we talk only not about this section, but just most of the Satanic Rebellion series in general, because that is the wider context, the thing that set in motion the present state of the universe. After that, we talked about the actual introduction to this study, which dealt with using the example of Adam and Eve in their state after being kicked out of the garden as a framing example for us in our own lives and how we face the same things that they faced after being kicked out of paradise. So specifically, we talked about all of the realities and the negative things that Adam and Eve faced after the fall. We talked about God's promise of deliverance as given in the prophecy in Genesis 3:15, and also as foreshadowed by the robes of animals that God gave to Adam and Eve, the so-called protoevangelium. And then we talked about how we are sort of in the same parallel situation that they found themselves in. So the same spiritual realities that held back then, namely that we face a life of sin and then inevitable death, bringing us face to face with the Creator. Well, that still holds for us to this day. And then after all this, we went through the high level points in the first section in this study, talking about our identity as strangers in the devil's world. So that is what we did today. And next time we will pick up talking about this first point, sojourners in the devil's world, in a great deal more depth.